Thank you. This will be a very, very brief introduction in light of the earlier presentation, just to give you a sense of who Bob Alter is and some of the work that he's done aside from this grand achievement of the translation with commentary of the Hebrew Bible. He's professor in the graduate school and an emeritus faculty member in the Department of Comparative Literature and Near Eastern Studies. His range of scholarship spans just an enormous breadth, from the 19th century European and American novel to modern Hebrew literature, and of course literary aspects of the Bible, which you've been hearing a lot about. Among his very, very many books, and I don't know how many we'd count these as, it's 3 volumes, but many, many books, are A Critical Biography of Stendhal, works on modernism and self-conscious fiction, essays on literary theory, and many, many books on literary aspects of the Bible. In 2009, he received the Robert Kirsch Award from the LA Times for lifetime contribution to American letters. Without further ado, Bob Alter on translating the Bible. Bob.
Thank you very much, Tony. And I express my gratitude to the 3 panelists, all of whom I thought were very perceptive and interesting in different ways. Ron Hendel, as always, except when he talks about my tennis, is 100% correct. And about just one quick comment to Bob Hass and de-Christianizing the Bible. That is, I did not have an agenda to do this. I wanted to get back to the meaning of the Hebrew. And one perfect illustration is the 23rd Psalm, which is very beautiful, I agree, in the King James Version. Thou anointest my head with oil. And every modern translation, as far as I can see, follows the King James and uses the verb anoint. But in fact, it doesn't mean anoint. The verb to anoint, limshoach, which is cognate with Mashiach, Messiah, is used either for the consecration of priests or the conferral of kingship on kings. And this is a word which it has to do with luxuriance. And it kind of, as in the Odyssey, it feels good to rub, virgin olive oil into your head and other parts of your body. So it's a very this worldly thing. So I translated it as you moisten my head with oil. Okay, I won't say much about the King James version. It is grand, and as Bob Hass accurately says, there's a kind of expansive movement in the way it represents poetry, which is wonderful, eloquent, but quite different from the Hebrew. And there are lapses in style, which we don't often notice, and then all kinds of errors, because the grasp of Christian Hebraeus of Hebrew in the 17th century isn't what modern scholarship has. Okay, I'll leave it at that. The sundry modern translations by committee, I have to say, are almost uniformly wretched, and they're wretched for 2 reasons. One, I don't quite understand this because these are educated men. I think they're all male, so I'm not being sexist in using that, who have advanced degrees from Oxford and Cambridge and Harvard and Yale and the University of Pennsylvania and so forth. But they don't seem to have any sense of English style, and they often don't even seem to have a sense of English idioms. They violate idioms all the time, and there is this strange melange of levels of diction. One moment it's a little bit poetic, the next moment it sounds like the daily newspaper, and so forth. since they don't study aspects of literary aspects of the Bible in these august institutions where they get their training, they run roughshod over them. They don't see them because it's not part of their view of the Bible. And I would say, okay, I will leave it at that because I don't want to spend my time reviewing or overseeing contemporary translations or recent translations of the Bible. So I'm going to talk about a few aspects of translating the Bible where I believe translations that we have gone off track and how you get on track. So I'll begin with a very basic category, words. That is, we all naturally assume that a translation should give you an accurate representation in the target language of the meaning of the words in the source language. Now, admittedly, when the source language is removed from us by 2,500, 2,700 years, it's not easy to recover the meanings. And I'm sure that this is true for scholars of Homer and classical Greek poetry in general. But there are many things that one can recover. So I will begin, let me begin with the very short line at the bottom. This is a mistake that, as far as I know, has been made in every single English translation of the Bible. It's just before the Sinai Epiphany, and God says to Moses, I am about to come to you in Av He'anan. Now, the second word is a word that anybody who knows Hebrew knows. It means cloud. But what does the first word mean? All the English translators think it means thick. And they translate, I am about to come to you in a thick cloud. But it doesn't mean thick. That is, the word for thick is aveh, which has one more syllable and a consonant at the end roughly equivalent to the English H. What that little word av means is cloud. This may seem strange. It's sort of, it would be like in English, I'm about to come to you in the thunderhead of the cloud. So what do you make of that? And the way those two words are, by the way, it couldn't mean thick also because it's in the wrong syntactic position. The adjective would have to come after the noun. So what does it mean? This is what biblical grammarians call the construct state, where two nouns are joined together, like House of David, okay? But what happens when the two nouns joined together are synonyms, as here, the thunderhead of the cloud? I think invariably, as far as I know, you can correct me afterwards, Ron, biblical scholars have not noticed this, when two synonyms are joined in the construct state, it's an intensifier or a superlative. So this is not an ordinary thick cloud. You see here the nuance of meaning shift. It's not an ordinary thick cloud. It is, which we would see on a day like this, but it is a kind of super cloud. It's a mythological cloud. It's the appropriate vehicle in which the God of creation reveals himself to Moses. So I translate it as the utmost cloud, which is strange, but I think it picks up the strangeness of the Hebrew. So here you have a matter of lazy philology. But let's go back now to the first example, where you have an instance of out-and-out mistaken philology. Okay, a little parenthetical remark. I think that biblical scholars often don't do philology correctly. Partly the laziness, but even more common is they don't look at the narrative or poetic context, which gives you a clue to what the words mean. So, in the Samson story, I'm sure most of you will remember, Samson makes a wager with the 30 Philistine wedding guests that if they can solve his riddle, he will give them 30 chalifot of garments. And the meaning here is not in dispute. It means changes of garments. They find out the solution to the riddle by wheedling it out of his wife. And Samson, realizing what they've done, is outraged. And he storms down to Gaza and kills 30 Philistines. In a minute, I'll say what kind of Philistines he kills. And he takes from each of them their chalitzot. Now, that looks similar, but it's not the same word. It has an L sound in the middle rather than an F sound in the middle. What does it mean? All translations, well, it's a synonym for, going back to the King James, it's a synonym for garment. And they translate it as tunic, clothing, whatever. For some reason, one British translation translated as belt. I don't even think they wore belts. Now, there's only one other place in the Hebrew Bible that this word chalitza appears as something you wear. And that's in an exciting moment in 2 Samuel when Saul's general in the civil war between the house of David and the house of Saul is being pursued by a swift-footed young man named Asael. And he doesn't want to kill him because he knows if he kills him, it's going to make bad blood between him and Asael's murderous brothers. So he says, "Swerve you to your right or your left, and seize for yourself one of the lads, and take you his chalitza." Now, most of us will know that what you take from the body of a slain foe on the battlefield is not his belt or his shirt or anything like that. You take his armor. We know this from reading the Iliad. The Septuagint translators, who of course knew the Iliad very thoroughly, got this, and they translated it as armor. The King James, who both knew the Iliad in Greek and knew the Septuagint, also got it right. But all the modern translations make it some kind of garment, reading back to the Samson story. Now, when you see that it has to mean armor, and by the way, I would suggest that it's cognate with the biblical noun chalutz, which means military vanguard. So the chalitza was what a fighter in the vanguard was wearing. Then all of a sudden, a little light bulb comes on in the Samson story. That is, Samson goes down to Gaza, and he doesn't kill 30 ordinary Philistines. He kills 30 Philistine warriors. It's like kind of sending a message to the wedding guests. And he brings back to them, sticking it to them, 30 pieces of armor, 30 sets of armor, which are far more valuable than 30 changes of garments. So you can see what I mean about looking at the narrative context. Now, let me proceed to one more example of, here it's a poetic context. At the end of 2 Samuel, there's a victory psalm attributed to David, and there's one word that's puzzled readers since ancient times. The speaker, celebrating the victory that God has granted him, says, You gave me your shield of rescue. Your anot made me many. Now, what is anot? When this same poem was transcribed into the 18th Psalm, the scribe puzzled over, what is anot? So he changed it to anava, which means humility. And that didn't help much either. So the translators flounder, and they translate it as, well, some translate it as humility, some say your answering power, your providence, which has no warrant, whatever. But anot appears at one other point. That's when Moses comes down from the mountain and he hears the revelry of the Israelites dancing before the golden calf. He says to Joshua, not the sound of anot in triumph and not the sound of anot in defeat, a sound of anot I hear. Now, anot has two meanings in the Bible. One is to answer, but the other is simply to speak out or to call out. And that's what is operative here. That is, notice it has in Exodus a military context. And I think that it means something like battle cry. That is, in the poem in Samuel, it's part of a list of weapons that God gives the speaker of the poem. So when he says, your anot made me many, that is, you gave me a battle cry like the sword of the Lord and of David, right? And that struck terror in the hearts of the enemies. And even though we were few, we seemed like many. So again, you have to look at the literary context. Now, to go on with words for a minute, there in 2 Samuel, one of the many episodes in the Bible not read in Sunday school, David's son Amnon lusts after his beautiful half-sister Tamar, and he contrives to lure her into his bedchamber by pretending to be ill, and then he rapes her. So there is this peculiar word that appears both as a noun and a cognate verb. Here's the verb. Let Tamar, my sister, pray come and tavreni with food and prepare the biryah, there's the cognate noun, before my eyes. Now, all the translations render this as food and feeding. But that's not what it means. There are other words much more common in biblical Hebrew for food and feeding. This appears only a few times, but it's used maybe half a dozen times in this strange episode. And it's a word for food that always is food given to somebody who has been fasting or is failing, is doing poorly physically. That's in Rabbinic Hebrew, a Sudat Havra'ah is a feast that's given to a mourner when he comes back from the cemetery. And so you can't just translate it flatly as food, and I chose resisting the temptation to translate it as chicken soup because the chicken had not yet been domesticated. You know, the way history gets in the way of translators, very frustrating. So I translate it as nourishment, which at least gets some of the nuance of the Hebrew. Okay, let us go on to dialogue. Now, here's a simple and famous example where the modern translations get it half right, but only half right. And Jacob prepared a stew, and Esau came from the field, and he was famished. And Esau said to Jacob, let me gulp down some of this red stuff, for I am famished. And Jacob said, sell now your birthright to me. I'll stop that there to save time. Okay, these are rather the first words that each of the twin brothers speaks, and those are always characterizing moments in biblical narrative. So there's an unusual verb for eating, apparently a crude eating term, and the translators get this right, the modern ones, and say, let me gulp down. The King James Version on the red stuff misses the boat entirely and says, give me some of that red pottage, totally normalizing it. And by the way, that is one of the grave errors in translating biblical dialogue. The assumption is that they all have to always speak correct Hebrew, and you make a correct English. But that's not necessarily true, because it's mimetic dialogue. It's the great precursor of novelistic dialogue. So people that is, the modern translators do say this red stuff, but they miss the doubling of the red, this red stuff. In fact, the Hebrew is simply this red, which doesn't quite work in English. So you have to get the irregularity of the Hebrew. Okay, now here is the episode in Genesis in which Abraham is sojourning in Gerar, and he passes Sarah off as his sister, and she's taken into the king's harem, Abimelech. And God came to Abimelech in a night dream and said to him, you are a dead man because of the woman you took, as she is another's wife. And I wish I could have done it a little better. The Hebrew is only 2 syllables, hincha meit. I thought that you're dead was a little bit too abrupt in English, but it's a little shocking to be addressed by God in this abrupt manner when you're trying to get a good night's sleep. But Abimelech had not come near her, and he said, my Lord, will you slay a nation even if innocent? Now this is weird. But I've replicated the weirdness of the Hebrew. It's Hagoy gam tzadik taharog. And when he says a nation, he's speaking to himself, I suppose, as the head of the nation. But the way it's formulated brings us as readers back to the previous episode, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where Abraham bargained with God, will you slay the righteous, the innocent, together with the wicked, and then he slew a whole nation, of course. So is God up to his old tricks again? Then didn't she not say to me, she is my sister, and she too said, he is my brother. Now this is a sputter of indignation. V'hi gam hi amra. And the translations don't do this. If characters don't stutter in the Bible. So there's and she said as well, or something anodyne like that. Okay, let's go on. Now, when Abraham is summoned to Abimelech in the morning, he says, what have you done, Abimelech says, what have you done to us, and how have I offended you that you should bring upon me and my kingdom so great an offense? Things that should not be done you have done to me. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what did you imagine when you did this thing? A little aside about narrative technique. We all know that in the Bible there's a set way of introducing direct speech. And X said to Y, and then you have the speech, and then Y answered and said to X. But there are exceptions. There are moments when an X said to Y, and then he talks. And then again, the formula for introducing speech, and X said to Y. In almost every one of these cases that I've spotted, this is an indication that Y is having a problem about responding, that he's embarrassed or befuddled or amazed or what, and I think that's what's going on here. So Abimelech repeats himself. What did you imagine when you did this thing? And Abraham said, for I thought there is surely no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. And in point of fact, she is my sister, my father's daughter, though not my mother's daughter, and she became my wife. Now, I may be wrong about this, but the expression he uses that I translate as in point of fact, omna, sounds to me like a legalism. You know, he's been worked into a corner, and then he puts up this little verbal smoke screen about which, of course, many gallons of scholarly ink have been poured trying to interpret. And it happened when the gods made me a wanderer from my father's house, that I told, I'm sorry, I left out an I, that I told her, this is the kindness you can do for me in every place to which we come, say of me, he is my brother. Now, as far as I know, the first translator, certainly in English, maybe in any language, who translated the word Elohim here as the gods. But on grammatical grounds, I'm entirely confident that I'm right. That is, one of the most common ways of designating God in the Hebrew is Elohim, which famously has a plural, masculine plural ending, but it's a singular noun. I think that it's probably a linguistic fossil from their other explanations, from the time when people talked about the gods. But there are a few rare instances in which Elohim appears grammatically as a plural. For example, when Aaron says of the golden calf, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And it's a plural here. He says, Vayehi kasher hitu oti Elohim. Those who know Hebrew, you can hear that's a plural verb. So what's going on? Something that might shock some sensibilities. Abraham is speaking to a polytheist. So he doesn't want to rock the boat. And he doesn't want to quite say that there's one God that imparted this destiny on him. So he says, Elohim, plural, the gods. It's maybe a manner of speaking like saying destiny, fate, circumstances, but that's what happened. Okay. Now, my last example from dialogue, and no, I have two examples, a short one and a long one. The longer one. David has fled to Transjordan because the throne has been usurped by his son Absalom. And then many of you may remember, Faulkner made it the title of his novel, that he tells the people, don't deal gently, in the lovely phrase of the King James, deal gently with the lad Absalom. In fact, his general, who is a hard-nosed practitioner of realpolitik, knows that the son has to be disposed of and make sure that he gets killed. And so when the victory of David is complete, a man named Ahimaaz comes sprinting across the plain to bring him the news. And he arrives presumably breathless and says to David, blessed is the Lord your God who has delivered over the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. Okay, in other words, victory. And the king said, is it well with the lad Absalom? Alas, you can't get the effect of the Hebrew. It's Hashalom Lana'ar of Shalom. And Ahimaaz said, I saw a great crowd to send the king's servant Joab and your servant, and I know not what. And the king said, turn aside, stand by. Now, I think you can see from the narrative context that Achimaatz is babbling. He's babbling because he doesn't want to tell David that his son has been killed. And so he becomes incoherent, and the Hebrew is incoherent. And every translation assumes, well, it's the Bible can never be incoherent, and they smooth it over in some way. But you can see from David's response, turn aside, stand by, that he's impatient with this guy who's just babbling. Okay, let's see if, okay, this is a small thing. The Israelite liberation fighter, otherwise known as the judge, in Judges 3, Ehud, is about to assassinate the big-bellied Moabite king who has been subjugating Israel, whose name is Eglon. And he says, "A secret word I have for you, king." Now, everything is carefully devised in that little speech. First, the fronting of the word, a secret word, that phrase, which catches the king's attention so that he leans forward and he tells everybody else to get out of the throne room. By the modern translation says, I have a confidential message for you. The second thing is his form of address. As you read the modern translations, and the sentence starts out like this: Your Majesty, or my Lord. And of course, biblical Hebrew is full of locutions of deference to figures in power, but they don't occur here. That is, he adds king at the end of his little speech, almost as an afterthought. So he's being very rude, but Eglon doesn't get it. He hears secret word, and it's some kind of oracle. This is great. And he exposes himself to being stabbed in the belly. The modern translators, they remember the Shakespeare they read in high school, and they put in something like, my liege, or your majesty, or whatever. Okay, let us go on to sound play and word play, which is one of the hardest things, but one of the most fun things to translate when you can. You can't always do that. This is Psalm 30. The speaker in the psalm has been near death and then has recovered. And he says in one line, "What profit in my blood, in my going down deathward?" Now, by the way, the modern translation will say, what profit is there in my death? Because they systematically transpose metaphors into what the metaphor refers to on the clueless assumption that modern readers can't understand a metaphor. I like to give a lot of credit to readers, actually. So, now, the Hebrew, or the first half of that first line, sounds like this: Ma betza bidami. You can hear the rhythm with the three stresses, and the King James does this as, what profit is there in my blood? And the is there is italicized to show that it's only implied in the Hebrew. But what it does is it wrecks the rhythm of the line. And if you just drop out, I do a lot of dropping out of extraneous words. If you just drop out the is there, you come up with what profit in my blood, which is ma betza bidami. It's the same cadence. Now, toward the end of the same psalm, the speaker says, you have turned my misped to a machol for me. There's the Hebrew, hafachta mispedi lemachol li. Now, a misped is in modern Hebrew, it means a eulogy, but in biblical Hebrew, it's a chant or speech, maybe speech, said over the dead, and machol is dance. When I read that line, I realized that the alliteration was extremely important, because what the poet was saying is that you took one miserable state in which I was plunged, which begins with the consonant M, and you flipped it into its opposite, which also begins with the consonant M. And every once in a while, not always, you get lucky as a translator. And as I stared at the page in which I write by hand all my drafts, I said, wait a minute. There's a very good English word for a chant of mourning that begins with a D. That's dirge. So you have turned my dirge to a dance for me. Okay, now from Isaiah, this was maybe a little bit more of a stretch. Yeah, we have that up there. The he here is God. He hoped for mishpat, which means justice, and look, mispach, which means blight. For tzedakah, which means righteousness, and look, tza'akah, which means a scream. It's very powerful, but you hear the word play. And Isaiah, as a poet, is a past master of sound play, where he very often, as here, juxtaposes two like-sounding words that mean the opposite in order to manifest linguistically the perversion of values in the kingdom of Judah. So by stretching a little bit, especially in the second line, I said, he hoped for justice and look, jaundice. Well, jaundice is a kind of blight, so that wasn't too much of a liberty. For righteousness and look, wretchedness. Now, that's okay. I had slight misgivings, and if you're not honest when you translate a great work of literature, you have misgivings all the time, right, Bob? Wretchedness is not the same as a scream, and it loses the edge of violence in a scream, but if you're wretched, you might be inclined to scream. Okay, now rhythm, I have just two more categories, and I will try to finish in a very few minutes. This is from Genesis 1, as most of you will recognize. And God made the two great lights, the great light for dominion of day, and the small light for dominion of night, and the stars. Now, when I started translating Genesis, and I didn't quite know what I was doing, I wrote down, this was the same as in my draft, but then I stopped myself and I said, why dominion? Okay, first there was a grammatical reading. That is, the existing translations all translate it as an infinitive, to rule over, to govern, or worst of all, in the new JPS, to dominate. As in a sentence like Soviet Russia dominated the smaller states of Eastern Europe. This is what I mean by a tin ear for English usage in the modern versions. So, but I said that was, the Hebrew is a verbal noun, memshelet, and that was my conscious motive. But my unconscious motive, which was more important actually, was the sound. That is, the Hebrew sounds like this. Et ha'ma'or hagadol lememshelet hayom, v'et ha'ma'or hakaton lememshelet halayla v'et hakochavim. It's a beautiful cadence, which I more or less reproduce. That is, Dominion has the same rhythmic structure as memshelet. And then I realized that the cadence was very important to the meaning of the priestly writer responsible for this line, because his vision of creation is as perfect, harmonious order. Everything falls into place in a kind of celestial choreography. And the cadence, with the wonderful balancing of rhythmic units, gives you an embodiment in sound of his sense of harmony. Okay, now one more example of a rhythm, and then I'll go on to my final category. You may remember that in the David story, after he has had adulterous sex with Bathsheba and contrived the murder of her husband, Nathan the prophet comes to him and confronts him with a parable. It's that parable that ends with "Thou art the man" in the King James Version. And probably, I strongly suspect that that Shakespeare in Hamlet had this in mind, whether the play's the thing wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. Here it's not a play, but it's a parable. And Nathan does catch David's conscience. So here's the beginning. Well, here's the whole parable. 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor. The rich man had sheep and cattle in great abundance, and the poor man had nothing save one little ewe that he had bought. And he nurtured her and raised her with him together with his sons. From his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie, and she was to him like a daughter. Now, the Hebrew reader, or the Hebrew audience, perhaps I should say, will hear that the rhythm of this parable is totally different from the surrounding rhythms of the narrative. It's what marks it as a parable, and David doesn't get it. He thinks it's the report of an actual legal case. And it's a kind of sing-song rhythm. That is, the beginning is Shnei Anashim Hayu Be'ir Achad Ashir V'Achad Rash, like that. So I tried to do that. By the way, I know that no one will notice this in reading, but it gave me satisfaction. 2 men there were in a single town. One was rich and the other poor. And then what particularly pleased me was from his crust she would eat, and from his cup she would drink, and in his lap she would lie. Every one of those nouns is a monosyllable in the Hebrew. That is, crust is pat, cup is kos, lap is chek, and I felt good when I could find English equivalents. Okay. Now, my last category, I will rush to my conclusion, is word order. Okay, Joseph's brothers have come to him in Egypt, and they don't recognize him. He's the regent of all Egypt, and he accuses them of being spies and then takes Simeon as a hostage. They come back to poor old Jacob and tell him that Simeon is being held hostage, and that the man who rules over all Egypt will not see them again unless he brings down Benjamin, Joseph's whole brother. So these are Jacob's words in response. Me you have bereaved. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more. and Benjamin you would take, it is I who bear it all. Now, the word order here looks strange, right? Is the syntactic inversion. I want to say something that modern translators veer away from inversion of syntax because they think it's bizarre and archaic. I think that any modestly literate reader of English will recognize that if you go back a little bit in, say, English poetry, back to English poetry before modernism, there's syntactic inversion all over the place. Like probably a lot of readers have read in high school Keats's ode on first looking into sonnet on first looking into Chapman's Homer, which begins, "Much have I wandered in the realms of gold," which is syntactically like "me you have bereaved." Now this is faithful to the Hebrew. That is, the normal way in biblical Hebrew to say "you have bereaved me" is to say shikaltuni. You take the verb to bereave and you put an accusative suffix at the end of it. But the writer decided to do it differently. He puts oti, me, at the beginning, and then the verb to bereave, shikaltem, oti shikaltem. And I think that he's making a point. He's making a point that Jacob, old Jacob, as what I've called elsewhere prima donna of paternal grief, puts himself at the beginning, "Me you have bereaved. I'm such a long sufferer." And then on me is all the burden at the very end, alai hayu kulana. Okay, last example. No, last two examples, I'm sorry. That assassination of Eglon that I referred to before, the assassin Ehud escapes through some mysterious rear entrance. I've read long scholarly articles trying to figure out where it is, and no one really knows. Leaving the slain king lying on the floor with his short sword sticking out of his belly. And by the way, a little scatological detail, as he's scabbed, the anal sphincter is released. So his courtiers outside the locked doors of this cool chamber where he is smell something. And they say, well, he's probably relieving himself. Give him a little time. But he doesn't come out. And then they try the doors, and the doors are locked. And they took the key and opened the doors. And look, their master was fallen to the ground dead. Now, notice how carefully, there's the look, hine, the Hebrew presentative, is usually used to indicate a shift to the character's point of view. So they look, and first they see their master, then they take in the fact that he's fallen to the ground, and then the ultimate fact about him, that he's dead. And all the translations mess with the word order and lose the vividness of their point of view seeing their assassinated king. And now, one last example, a kind of famous one, that's at the beginning of the episode that Bob has read, the binding of Isaac. God says to Abraham, "Take, pray, your son, your only one, whom you love, Isaac." Now, all the modern versions do something like, "Take your beloved Isaac, your only son," or "Take your favorite son, Isaac," or "Take Isaac, your favorite son," even worse. But in fact, the sequence of words is extremely important. And the Midrash and Rashi in medieval France, following the Midrash, got this exactly right. That is, Rashi invents an imaginary dialogue between Abraham and God. You know, in the actual text, Abraham doesn't speak. He says, "Take, pray, your son." Abraham says to God, "But I have two sons." And he says, "You're only one." And Abraham says, "This one is an only one to his mother, and this is an only one to his mother, whom you love." And Abraham says, "Well, I love both my sons." The midrashic version is even more, are there any partitions in the guts of love? And then at the very end, Isaac. It's important that it's the very end. So at the end of God's command, he sees that there's no squirming out of it. It's his beloved Isaac that he's being asked to sacrifice. Okay, these are a few examples, and I would be happy to expatiate on my thinking behind them, and many other instances of where I think that by paying attention to the literary fashioning, which is often, not invariably, but often exquisitely wrought and sophisticated fashioning, by paying attention to the literary fashioning of the biblical text, both in poetry and in narrative prose, you get more the nuance, and sometimes even more of what's actually going on and the complexity of the biblical books. And that's what I've dedicated myself to over these years. Thank you.
Thank you so very, very much. I know if you are anything like me, you sat there listening, dreaming about being able to sit down and read that those enormous volumes, page by page, with Bob Alter by your side, explaining exactly why everything is said that way. But there is the commentary in the books. So I think we're very, very grateful to have those. We do have a reception just outside, and I invite you all to stay and mingle and chat with Bob and one another. Thank you again.